Mr. President.
Senator from Florida.
Is the Senate a quorum call?
It is not.
Mr. President, in a moment here, as my colleagues gather, we hope to be able to pass the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. I want to first acknowledge all the people who worked so hard on it, our staffs, obviously, and in addition, Senators Cardin, Risch, and Menendez, and over 50 co-sponsors, many of whom will join us here this evening. I also want to thank Leader McConnell and Schumer for their support in helping us get here. I want to thank Chairman Crapo, who has helped us make some important changes at the end that will make the sanctions easier to implement. A lot of people have been watching on the news the protests that are going on in Hong Kong and wondering perhaps the depths of what it's all about. When the United Kingdom handed Hong Kong over to China, they signed an agreement, what's known as the Joint Declaration, and it basically guaranteed a high degree of autonomy and freedom to the people of Hong Kong. As a result of that agreement, the United States has treated commerce and trade with Hong Kong differently than it has commercial and trade activity with the mainland of China. But what's happened over the last few years is the steady effort on the part of Chinese authorities to erode that autonomy and those freedoms. The most recent protests really began with a proposal to pass an extradition law that would allow the Chinese government to basically arrest and extradite someone in Hong Kong over to the mainland. And there was a huge pushback against that. And those protests emerged as a result of it. And even after the Hong Kong government pulled out from pursuing that agreement or pursuing that law, the protests have continued because the people of Hong Kong see what's coming. They see the steady effort to erode the autonomy and their freedoms. And the response by the Hong Kong authorities under tremendous pressure from Beijing is violence and repression. So far, over 5,000 people have been arrested in Hong Kong. The youngest was 12 years of age, the oldest 82. Hundreds more have been injured by both violence committed by police authorities, but also by street gangs, criminals, thugs, empowered and encouraged by Chinese authorities. And this effort by China to exert control and remove autonomy continues unabated. Just some examples. There was a law that was passed that banned wearing masks, and a Hong Kong court ruled that that ban was unconstitutional. Well, today, the so-called National People's Congress in Beijing ruled that Hong Kong courts have no authority, no power to review Hong Kong government legislation. Under pressure from Beijing, Hong Kong's government is threatening to cancel the November 24th elections. Elections, by the way, that China's been interfering in. They've pushed to ban critics like Joshua Wong from running. 7 candidates who are running have been attacked by street gangs during this campaign. 2 candidates have been arrested while campaigning. And now, in the latest move, China's pushing the Hong Kong government to pass what they call a new national security law, a law that would allow them to arrest political critics and opponents. And if this passes, if that happens, that's the very definition of control and de facto proof of all loss of autonomy. And by the way, China's also pushing for something very ominous. They call it patriotic education. What China's really pushing for in Hong Kong is moving from one country, 2 systems to one country, 1 system, the Chinese system. And so the bill that we'll bring up here in a moment with tremendous bipartisan support requires 5 quick things that I'll touch on. First, its most important element is it requires the Secretary of State to annually certify whether Hong Kong warrants being treated differently than China. If Hong Kong is no longer autonomous, and that's the rationale for different treatment, then they should no longer receive that treatment. It says that students in Hong Kong shouldn't be barred from entering the United States, getting a visa to study here, for example, because they've been the subject of a politically motivated arrest or detention. It says that for the next 7 years, the Secretary of Commerce is going to report on whether export controls and sanction laws are being enforced by the government of Hong Kong, or whether China is using Hong Kong to evade, as a backdoor to evade export controls and sanctions. It says that if Hong Kong ultimately returns and passes that extradition bill that China wants, the president has to present a plan to protect Americans from this law. And last but not least, it requests that the president identify, or it mandates that the president identify and sanction foreigners. The president determines, based on credible information, foreigners who are responsible for extraditions, for arbitrary detention, for torture, for forced confessions inside of Hong Kong, or any other human rights violations in Hong Kong. And by the way, would also allow blocking their assets of these persons if those assets are located here in the United States. And so, in a moment here, as we continue to gather, and we're awaiting the arrival of a companion legislation, I would yield the floor because I know we have a lot of important sponsors that are here that want to speak on this subject.
Madam President.
Senator Reiner.
Madam President, fellow senators, first of all, this is an important step that we're taking here. This is a matter that we've been discussing for a long time. There's been a lot of action on it. And I want to thank Senator Rubio and Senator Cardin, who are the lead sponsors of this bill and who have, on behalf of the committee, done yeoman's work getting it together and getting the bipartisan compromise to get the language here. Virtually all members of the committee have had fingerprints on this bill, and so in that regard, I think it's going to pass quite handily. I want to thank the banking staff, particularly my colleague from Idaho, Senator Crapo, who, of course, has the expertise, and the banking committee that has the expertise on these kinds of things, on sanctions. They were very helpful in hammering out the language that we needed for the sanctions. I want to thank the Banking Committee staff who was helpful. I want to thank the staff of the Foreign Relations Committee who worked for us, both the minority staff, Senator Menendez's staff, and my staff, the majority staff, for doing this, and all of the people who worked on this. So thank you to all of you. Look, since June, millions of people in Hong Kong have taken to the streets protesting the erosion of their rights and freedoms. Hong Kong was supposed to maintain a high degree of autonomy after China regained sovereignty over the territory in 1997. This wasn't just a verbal understanding. This was in the treaty that China signed with Great Britain. However, since that time, China's gradually chipped away at Hong Kong's autonomy, and this is now becoming a real problem. China now refers to its treaty with Great Britain as, quote, a historical document, and says it is no longer bound by its terms. This is just one of many examples that show that the Chinese government has no respect for the rule of law. After 2 decades of broken commitments, it is past time that we hold the Chinese Communist Party accountable. What it is doing in Hong Kong is just wrong. That is why I'm proud to join Senator Rubio and Senator Cardin and all the others who've had hands on this bill in bringing the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act to the Senate floor. This bill is a result of a strong bipartisan consensus that we must act in support of the Hong Kong people. Thank you all for helping. We'll get to the unanimous consent here in a little bit, but I'd like to yield the floor to Senator Cardin, please.
Madam President.
Senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me first thank Senator Rubio for his leadership on this issue, and Senator Menendez and Senator Risch for your leadership in our committee, and so many others that have been involved, because tonight we have a chance to reaffirm our commitment for human rights and democracy. And that's exactly what our legislation does. It recognizes the fact that for 24 consecutive weeks, the people of Hong Kong have been asking for their basic democracy and freedom. And Monday, it's been reported just yesterday that police fired 158 rounds of tear gas, 1,391 rubber bullets, 325 beanbag rounds, 265 sponge grenades. That's just yesterday on peaceful protesters who are asking nothing more than to exercise the rights that they were told would be protected, to express their views and to be able to have democracy in Hong Kong, which is where it was under the previous time. So Senator Rubio and I introduced legislation that the chairman and ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Richard Menendez, joined us, and we passed this bipartisan legislation on June 13th. It reaffirms the principles set forth in the United States Hong Kong Policy Act of 1992, which supports democratization, human rights, and autonomy in Hong Kong. Now, Senator Rubio already talked about this, but this is a very important thing. We gave Hong Kong a special status in its relationship with the United States that China does not enjoy. And we gave them that special status upon their protecting democracy and human rights in Hong Kong. That was the commitment. And if they don't comply with that, this special status should no longer be available. And this legislation requires that we get information on a regular basis as to whether China is respecting the rights as we put in our legislation in 1992, that they notify us on a regular time frame. That's an important point, because if they don't, we shouldn't give them that protected status. Secondly, identifies persons who have suppressed basic freedoms, similar to what we've done in what's known as the Magnitsky sanctions. So those that are taking away the human rights of the people of Hong Kong would be subject to the same type of visa restrictions to visit America and to use our banking system. That makes a great deal of sense, and we know that's pretty effective. So it's time that we back up our words, our commitment to supporting Hong Kong's democratization, human rights, and autonomy with action. Let's make sure the people of Hong Kong know that the United States Congress and the American people stand in solidarity with them as the Chinese authorities, as we speak, are repressing the legitimate rights of the people of Hong Kong. We can stand with the people of Hong Kong for democracy and human rights by our actions this evening. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from New Jersey.
Madam President, I rise in support of the motion that shortly will be made by our colleague, the senator from Florida. I want to congratulate Senator Cardin and he for their leadership in this regard. I appreciate the chairman and myself having joined them and moving this expeditiously through the committee. And I'm looking forward to its critical passage on the floor. Time is of the essence. The people of Hong Kong are fighting for their lives. 6 months ago, millions of Hong Kong citizens took to the streets to peacefully protest the erosion of their democracy and their rights. Now, a half a year later, we find mounting anger and unrest, with the violence against students and protesters, most dramatically in the crackdown on Hong Kong's Polytech University, only getting worse. People are being shot. Universities are being burned. The violence perpetrated by the authorities in Hong Kong and, by extension, Beijing, are turning the city into a battlefield. This is not the Hong Kong that any of us want to see. The special character of Hong Kong is one of the world's great success stories. The vibrancy of the people of Hong Kong, especially its young people and the rising generation of leaders standing up for democracy and self-governance, should inspire all of us. We admire Hong Kong's success as a burgeoning economic powerhouse, and we admire the vibrant and autonomous civil society and civic life that has flourished under the one country, two systems principle. Hong Kong is one of the remarkable success stories of the Indo-Pacific, one of the most remarkable success stories of the China and Chinese people, and it is a success worth protecting. So I call on the police to act professionally and to treat its fellow citizens with respect and restraint. We call for Beijing and the Hong Kong authorities to address the noble and legitimate aspirations of the people of Hong Kong. And in these turbulent times, the Congress of the United States must lead with our values. We must stand on the side of freedom and human dignity. And we must send a clear and uncompromising statement that America stands with the people of Hong Kong in their quest to maintain their self-governance and autonomy, to safeguard their human rights, to exercise their democratic freedom, to determine their own future. The House of Representatives have already passed their version of this bill, and the situation in Hong Kong grows more tenuous by the day. That's why the United States should and must act today. I look forward to its passage without delay. Let us work to hold China accountable for the erosion of democracy in Hong Kong. And let us together send a message to the people of Hong Kong that their cries for democracy and freedom have been heard through both chambers of the United States Congress, and that America stands with them in their call for justice and self-determination. With that, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Arkansas.
The Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act is really about promises, making promises and keeping promises. Unfortunately, the Chinese Communist Party has a long history of making promises but not keeping them. You can ask a rice farmer from Stuttgart, you can ask a software programmer from Fayetteville, a factory worker from Fort Smith, a Christian missionary from Searcy. In this case, China promised in 1984 that it would uphold the one country, two systems approach to Hong Kong when it took over in 1997. They practice one's religion as one sees fit, to speak the freedom to practice one's religion as one sees fit, to speak one's mind and to participate in the political process. But that's just another process they're on the verge, or promise they're on the verge of breaking. Apparently, the one country, two systems approach can't satisfy Beijing's rapacious appetite. They look and covet at Hong Kong's wealth, and they fear and loathe its freedom, which stands in shining contrast to the Orwellian oppression on the mainland. In fact, they fear that mainland Chinese might look across the bay and start to get ideas. So the Chinese Communist Party has been breaking its promises to Hong Kong and to the world, waging a brutal campaign to absorb Hong Kong into its dystopian high-tech dictatorship. Hong Kongers are bravely resisting in the face of this kind of escalating violence. In recent days, Hong Kong security forces have shot a protester in the stomach. They've trapped hundreds of students in a university using rubber bullets and tear gas on them, and they've threatened them with mass arrest. Beijing's propagandists have been hinting that even harsher measures are on the way. An article in the party-controlled China Daily argues that Beijing must accelerate Hong Kong's integration with the mainland and then re-educate Hong Kongers just like they were doing on a mass scale to 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps in Xinjiang. So I said this in the summer when the protests started. Let me say it again. It would be a grave mistake of historic proportion, surpassing the massacre of Tiananmen Square, if Beijing were to impose martial law, occupy, or otherwise crack down on Hong Kong. But the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act is about more than China making and breaking promises. It's also about the United States finally enforcing China's promises. We have a shot to avert catastrophe, protect the people of Hong Kong, and to finally enforce Beijing promises or hold them accountable for breaking those promises. Very soon, the Senate will pass this legislation on a unanimous, bipartisan basis to give you a sense of sentiment in the Congress. This legislation will require the Secretary of State to certify Hong Kong's autonomy from the mainland each year. Otherwise, they will lose the special privileges that U.S. law currently grants to Hong Kong. The bill will freeze the assets and travel of officials who are responsible for abducting Hong Kongers, like the journalists and booksellers who have been vanishing without a trace since 2017. And it will ensure that pro-democracy protesters can get visas to the United States despite their specious arrests. But if the Chinese Communist Party will simply pull back from the brink, if they will keep their promises, if they will respect the one country, two system approach, none of that. or give Americans and the world keep its promises, or give Americans and the world one more reason to treat China like an outlaw regime. So choose wisely, Mr. General Secretary Xi.
President.
Senator from Illinois.
Madam President, I want to thank my colleagues, Senator Rubio, Cardin Menendez, and Representative Chris Smith for moving the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act in both chambers, legislation which I'm proud to co-sponsor. With the situation deteriorating by the hour in Hong Kong, the passage of legislation couldn't be more timely, and I urge my colleagues in the House to take action quickly after we have acted. This bill sends an important message of bipartisan support from the U.S. Congress for the democratic aspirations of the broad majority of the people of Hong Kong. Some of you may realize that we, just a few months ago, celebrated the 30th anniversary of the bloody crackdown that ended the peaceful democracy movement in Tiananmen Square. Who among us can forget those riveting weeks during which there was real hope and possibility of China opening its political system? The Goddess of Democracy statue modeled after our own Statue of Liberty, and sadly, the jarring image of a protester standing to try to block the onslaught of a tank. The crude propaganda and disinformation used by communist hardliners to brainwash young military conscripts to turn on their own people, both heartbreaking and infuriating. Remembering those days, we must not sit by idly and quietly and allow Hong Kong's freedoms to be similarly threatened. I've been moved by the courageousness of the pro-democracy protesters in the face of increasingly excessive use of force by Hong Kong police in one of the most vibrant cities in the world. And what exactly are the Hong Kong protesters fighting for? The freedoms we in America take for granted every day. The freedom of assembly, suffrage, speech, due process, and rule of law. Rather than sitting down with the protesters, Hong Kong authorities have increasingly used excessive force instead of engaging in constructive dialogue. Ultimately, I believe the Hong Kong government and the protesters are capable of finding a solution, and I hope that they do. Let me end by appealing to the leadership in China to show the courage to allow the continued prosperous democratic autonomy enjoyed by the people of Hong Kong. Hong Kong's continued special status is a sign of strength and confidence, not weakness. I yield the floor.
Madam President,
Senator from Florida.
I rise today to speak about the greatest threat the United States faces in the next century, the threat of Communist China. I've been saying it for months. Communist China is not our friend. They are stealing our technology, refusing to open up their markets to